Have you ever had those thoughts that keep popping into your head, but you brush them off like they're nothing? What if I told you that those thoughts might not be random at all? What if those thoughts are God trying to speak to you? Every time you ignore them, you could be ignoring God. What if today is the day you finally start listening? We all have those moments, right? Those times when something just pops into our minds. Maybe it's a thought about helping someone, or something nudging us to act differently. We brush them off, thinking it's just our imagination, or we convince ourselves that we'll do it later. But what if those thoughts are more than just random ideas? What if they're actually God trying to guide us, protect us, or call us to something greater? In this video, we're going to dive into why ignoring those subtle thoughts could actually be a sign that you're ignoring God, and why paying attention to them could completely change your life. You'll learn why those seemingly small moments matter, and how they could be a divine opportunity you're missing. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll be looking at every thought with new eyes, ready to listen for God's voice in the everyday. We've all been there, sitting in a quiet moment, feeling a little tug in our hearts. Maybe it's a thought to reach out to someone you haven't spoken to in a while. Or maybe it's a nudge to do something kind for someone else, even when it's inconvenient. We often ignore these thoughts, chalking them up to our own mind or overactive conscience. But what if that nagging thought isn't just you thinking too much? What if it's God speaking directly to you? The truth is, God doesn't always speak in loud, dramatic ways. He doesn't always send a sign that's obvious or easy to understand. Instead, He speaks to us in quiet, subtle ways, through thoughts, feelings, and moments of quiet reflection. It's easy to dismiss these as coincidence or random thoughts. But God often uses these gentle nudges to guide us in the right direction. If you look at the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19, he's in a moment of despair, feeling alone and defeated. God doesn't speak to him in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, He speaks to Elijah in a gentle whisper. The quietness of that moment is a reminder that God often speaks in ways that require us to stop, listen, and pay attention. It's not always a booming voice or a grand miracle. Sometimes it's the still, small voice in your heart, urging you to act in love or make a change. But why do we ignore these thoughts? For many of us, it's because we're busy. Our lives are filled with noise, distractions, worries, and the constant rush of the day-to-day. We're constantly moving from one task to the next, and those small nudges get drowned out by everything else. But ignoring these thoughts doesn't just mean missing out on small opportunities to help others or grow as a person. It could mean missing out on something God wants to do in your life. Think about it. What happens when you ignore the call to act with kindness? Maybe you miss a chance to change someone's day, or maybe you miss an opportunity to grow spiritually. When we ignore those thoughts, we also miss God's invitation to grow closer to Him. It's like turning away from the very guidance that could lead to something better, something more meaningful. But God doesn't just give up on us. He's patient, and He continues to speak, even when we don't listen. Every time we ignore that still, small voice, it can be easy to feel distant from God. Over time, it becomes harder to hear Him, and we may even wonder why we're not experiencing the closeness we once had. It's not because He's left us, it's because we've stopped listening. This isn't just about the big life decisions either. God speaks to us in the small, everyday moments. Every time you ignore that nudge to check in on a friend or speak truth into someone's life, You're missing a chance to be part of God's work in the world. Each moment we ignore Him, we create a barrier between us and the life He's calling us to live. The truth is, when we ignore those thoughts, we're ignoring God's gentle guidance. And if we're not careful, we may find ourselves drifting further from the path He wants for us. But the good news is this: it's never too late to start listening. Every time we choose to tune into those small whispers, we open the door to something bigger. We allow God to use us in ways we never imagined, and we open ourselves up to the peace and purpose that comes from following His guidance. Ignoring these thoughts, these subtle nudges from God, is often something we do without even realizing it. It's not always a conscious decision to turn away from His guidance, but rather a result of our busyness, fear, or even pride. We convince ourselves that we don't need to act on these thoughts right now, or that they're just fleeting ideas that don't really matter. But what happens when we ignore God's voice repeatedly? The consequences are more significant than we might realize. First, ignoring God's whispers can lead to a gradual spiritual numbness. When we choose to ignore Him in the small things, it becomes easier to ignore Him in the big things. The more we silence His voice, the less likely we are to recognize it when He's trying to speak clearly into our lives. It's like turning down the volume on a radio. At first, the sound is just quieter, but if you keep turning it down, eventually it becomes inaudible. In the same way, if we don't listen to God's small promptings, we can find ourselves spiritually deaf, unable to hear His guidance when it really matters. Ignoring these thoughts also affects our relationship with God. God doesn't force Himself upon us. He invites us to listen, to trust Him, and to walk with Him. But when we ignore Him, we create distance between ourselves and Him. It's like being in a conversation with someone who keeps talking, but refuses to listen. Eventually, the other person might stop speaking altogether, feeling unheard and unimportant. It's the same with God. If we keep ignoring Him, we might find that His voice becomes harder and harder to hear. Another consequence of ignoring God's thoughts is missing out on the blessings He has for us. God doesn't just guide us for His own sake. He leads us because He knows what's best for us. Those nudges to act in kindness, to make a difficult decision, or to reach out to someone, they aren't just random. They are divine invitations to walk in His will and experience the fullness of life He has planned for us. When we ignore those invitations, we miss out on the blessings that come from aligning our lives with God's purpose. These aren't just spiritual blessings. They can be emotional, relational, and even physical. God's guidance always leads to something good, but we have to be willing to listen and act. And there's also the impact on others. When God speaks to us and we choose to ignore it, we're not just affecting ourselves, we're also affecting the people around us. Those small acts of kindness or obedience can have a ripple effect, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. You might think that your decision to ignore a thought doesn't matter. But what if that thought was God's way of prompting you to help someone in need? What if it was His way of calling you to say something that could change someone's life? Every time we ignore these thoughts, we're potentially missing an opportunity to be God's hands and feet in the world. The real danger in all of this is that we can easily slip into a place where we no longer recognize God's voice at all. When we repeatedly ignore His guidance, it becomes easier to dismiss Him, and eventually, we might find ourselves in a place of spiritual dryness, where the things of God no longer stir our hearts. We become numb to the very voice that once gave us direction, comfort, and peace. This is a dangerous place to be because it means we've stopped listening to the one who knows what's best for us. But there's hope. It's never too late to start listening again. God is always calling us back, always ready to speak into our lives. If you've ignored him for a while, don't be discouraged. The more you choose to listen, the more you will hear. It's a journey. But each step you take toward hearing his voice again brings you closer to the life he's calling you to. God's whispers are always there, waiting for us to tune in. When we start paying attention, we begin to see how much he's been guiding us all along. All we have to do is listen. The question we now face is, why do we ignore these thoughts in the first place? If we know deep down that they could be God's way of speaking to us, why do we continue to dismiss them? There are a few key reasons, and understanding them can help us break the pattern of ignoring God's voice in our lives. One of the main reasons we ignore these thoughts is fear. We fear the change that might come if we actually act on them. It's one thing to think about doing something, but it's another thing to actually follow through. If God is calling you to make a change in your life, maybe it's to step out of your comfort zone, change your career, or have a difficult conversation. Fear of the unknown can be paralyzing. The idea of stepping into something unfamiliar or challenging can cause us to hesitate, even if we know it's the right thing to do. But what we fail to see in those moments is that the fear of change often keeps us stuck in places we were never meant to stay. When we follow God's prompting, it's always for our good, even when it feels intimidating at first. Another reason we ignore God's thoughts is the distraction of daily life. We live in a world full of noise, social media, work, relationships, endless tasks, and it can be hard to quiet ourselves enough to hear God's voice. In the hustle and bustle of life, we push those small thoughts to the back of our minds because we're focused on what's immediately in front of us. We think we don't have time to slow down, to reflect, or to listen. But the irony is that by ignoring these thoughts, we miss out on the deeper meaning and peace that comes from aligning our lives with God's will. The more we allow distractions to drown out his voice, the harder it becomes to hear him at all. There's also the issue of pride. Sometimes, we ignore God's guidance because we think we know better. We think we have everything under control and that we don't need help, especially in areas where we feel competent or self-sufficient. We might brush off those thoughts because we believe we've got it all figured out. But God often calls us to places where we need to rely on him, to step into humility, and to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. Ignoring his guidance out of pride only distances us from the very help and wisdom we need. Sometimes, we ignore these thoughts because we're afraid of what they might require of us. What if God is calling us to give up something we love or change a part of our lives that feels comfortable? The thought of sacrifice can feel overwhelming, but we have to remember that God's call is always for our good. He's not asking us to give up something for no reason. He's asking us to let go of what might be holding us back from something better. Every time we ignore his guidance out of fear of sacrifice, we're missing out on the blessings he has in store for us. Lastly, we sometimes ignore these thoughts because we're too focused on the past. We let past failures, disappointments, and regrets dictate our present. We feel unworthy or incapable of following God's guidance because of our past mistakes. But the beauty of God's love is that it's never dependent on our past actions. He offers grace and forgiveness freely. Every time we ignore his call because of past hurts, we prevent ourselves from moving forward into the freedom he wants for us. God doesn't see us through the lens of our failures. He sees us through his grace, and he wants to lead us into a new beginning. Ignoring these thoughts, these whispers from God, is often a defense mechanism. We push them away because we're afraid, distracted, or too proud. But every time we ignore them, we miss an opportunity to grow closer to Him, to be transformed, and to experience the peace and purpose He offers. The real danger lies in allowing this cycle to continue unchecked. The more we ignore God, the more we harden our hearts, and the more difficult it becomes to hear Him. That's why it's so important to recognize when we're doing it and make the choice to stop. The good news is that we can change. Every time we choose to listen to God's voice, we open ourselves up to His guidance, His peace, and His direction. The more we listen, the more we'll hear. And the more we hear, the more we'll see the amazing ways God is at work in our lives. If you've been ignoring those thoughts, today is the day to start paying attention. God is speaking to you. Let's stop tuning Him out and start tuning in. It's not easy to change our habits, especially when it comes to listening to God. But the first step in breaking the pattern of ignoring His thoughts is to recognize the importance of what we're missing. When we ignore God, we're not just ignoring a set of thoughts or fleeting feelings, we're ignoring the Creator of the universe who has a purpose for our lives. These thoughts, these nudges, are invitations to walk in that purpose, to experience the fullness of what He has for us. And when we choose to listen, we step into a life that is richer, more meaningful, and aligned with God's plan. So how do we start listening? The first thing we need to do is slow down. We live in such a fast-paced world where every minute is filled with something to do, between work, family, social media, and everything else. It's easy to drown out the voice of God, but listening requires quiet and stillness. It's about taking the time to slow down and create space in our lives for God to speak, whether it's through prayer, meditation, or just sitting in silence. We need to intentionally make room for God's voice. In those moments of stillness, we can start to tune into the small whispers He's sending our way. It's not always easy to hear Him, especially if we've been ignoring Him for a long time. But the more we practice quieting ourselves and listening, the clearer His voice becomes. This takes time. But the more we choose to listen, the more we'll recognize when He's speaking to us. Another way to begin listening to God is by grounding ourselves in His Word. The Bible is full of wisdom and guidance, and often God speaks to us through the Scriptures. When we read the Bible, we allow God's voice to enter our lives directly. But it's not just about reading the words, it's about seeking to understand what God is saying to us through those words. The Holy Spirit helps us interpret the Scriptures and apply them to our daily lives. As we become more familiar with God's Word, we start to hear His voice more clearly, not just in Scripture, but in the thoughts and impressions He places on our hearts. It's also important to be honest with ourselves about the reasons we ignore God's thoughts. Sometimes, we don't want to listen because we're afraid of what He might ask of us. Maybe we're comfortable where we are, and the idea of change feels unsettling. But here's the truth. God's plans for us are always better than anything we could plan for ourselves. His guidance leads to life and peace, even when the road is difficult. When we stop resisting His will and start embracing His guidance, we open ourselves up to a life that's full of purpose, peace, and direction. Listening to God is an act of faith. It's choosing to trust that He knows what's best for us, even when we don't understand the reasons behind His nudges. It's letting go of our control and allowing God to lead us. That can be hard, especially if we're used to doing things our way. But God promises that when we trust Him and follow His lead, He will guide us through every decision and circumstance. One of the most powerful ways to listen to God is through community. God doesn't speak to us in a vacuum. He often uses others to confirm His guidance. Being in a community of believers allows us to hear God's voice through others' words, encouragement, and advice. When we're uncertain about something, Seeking wisdom from others can be a great way to discern whether God is speaking to us. It's also a reminder that we're not alone in this journey. God works through His people to help us grow, to guide us, and to support us along the way. Lastly, we need to be patient. Listening to God is not always a quick fix, and sometimes it takes time to fully understand what He's saying to us. There will be moments of doubt and confusion, but the more we trust Him, the more we'll start to recognize His voice in our lives. The key is persistence. If we keep choosing to listen, we will start to hear more clearly, and our relationship with God will grow deeper. The beautiful thing about God is that He's always ready to speak to us. No matter how many times we've ignored His voice, He's always there, waiting for us to listen. If you've been ignoring His thoughts, don't feel condemned. Instead, see this as an invitation to start fresh, to begin listening with new ears. God is speaking to you right now, and He has something incredible for you to hear. Will you choose to listen? When we choose to start listening, we begin a journey of transformation. The act of paying attention to those thoughts, those small nudges, opens up a whole new way of experiencing life. It's not just about hearing God's voice. It's about responding to it. It's about taking the time to say yes to what He's calling us to, even when it's uncomfortable or unfamiliar. One of the most profound shifts that happens when we start listening to God is the change in our peace. The more we tune into His voice, the more peace we experience, even in the midst of chaos. When we're aligned with God's will, we no longer feel like we're just stumbling through life, hoping things work out. Instead, we begin to walk with purpose and clarity. The decisions we make are guided by His wisdom, and that gives us confidence and a sense of calm that the world cannot offer. This peace also comes with a sense of direction. When we ignore God's thoughts, we often find ourselves lost or uncertain about which way to go. We might feel like we're stuck in a loop, unable to break free from the same old patterns. But when we start listening, we get a clear sense of where God is leading us. It's not always a road without challenges, but it's a road with purpose. We begin to understand that each step, even the difficult ones, is part of God's greater plan for our lives. Listening to God also brings us closer to others. As we align ourselves with His will, we become more compassionate, more loving, and more in tune with the needs of the people around us. The small acts of kindness, the encouragement, the willingness to help, these are the ways God uses us to bless others. We become His hands and feet, bringing light to the darkness and hope to those who are struggling. When we listen to God, we not only grow closer to Him, but we also become more connected to those He loves. But this journey doesn't always look the way we expect. Listening to God can mean making decisions that don't make sense to the world around us. It can mean stepping out in faith, taking risks, and doing things that seem impossible. But that's where the beauty lies. God doesn't ask us to have all the answers. He just asks us to trust Him. And when we trust Him, we find that His ways are always better than our own. It might be tempting to ignore the nudges, to convince ourselves that we can do things on our own. But every time we choose to listen, we take a step closer to the abundant life God has planned for us. Every time we choose to obey, we experience the fulfillment that comes from living in alignment with His purpose. There may be moments where you feel like you're not hearing God clearly, or where it's hard to trust what He's saying. But even in those moments, know that He's with you. He's not leaving you to figure it all out on your own. He's right there, ready to guide you, ready to help you hear Him more clearly, ready to show you the next step. The more we practice listening to God's voice, the more we recognize it in every part of our lives, in our thoughts, in our conversations, in our decisions. The key is consistency. The more we choose to listen, the easier it becomes to hear. And as we listen, we begin to live more fully, more purposefully, and more joyfully in His presence. Listening to God isn't just about hearing a voice. It's about developing a relationship with Him, learning to trust Him, and allowing Him to guide every part of your life. And once you start listening, you'll find that He's been speaking to you all along. It's just up to you to choose to listen. The more you do, the more you'll see the incredible things He's doing in your life. It's never too late to start. And every moment you choose to listen brings you closer to the life He's calling you to. If this message has resonated with you, it's time to take action. Start paying attention to those small thoughts, the quiet nudges, and the gentle whispers that God has been sending your way. Don't ignore them any longer. Take a moment today to reflect on what God might be calling you to do and how you can start listening more attentively. This could be the moment that changes everything for you, leading to a deeper connection with Him and a more purposeful life. If you want to continue on this journey of listening to God, make sure to like and subscribe for more videos that will help you recognize His voice and follow His guidance. And remember, it's never too late to start listening. Today can be the day you begin to hear God like never before.